What happens when a century-old royal secret threatens to destroy everything a monarch has worked to build? When palace guard Samuel Harrison witnessed King Edmund's explosive outburst in the private chambers of Thornwick Castle, he never imagined that moment would change the course of history forever. The words the king screamed that night would set in motion events that would rock the very foundation of the monarchy, expose buried family secrets, and force a nation to question everything they believed about their beloved royal family. This is the story of how one man's breaking point became a kingdom's awakening. Samuel Harrison had served as a palace guard at Thornwick Castle for 7 years, and in all that time, he had never seen King Edmund lose his composure. The monarch was known throughout the kingdom for his calm demeanor, his measured responses, and his ability to handle even the most challenging situations with grace. That's what made the events of that cold February evening so shocking. It started like any other night shift. Samuel was stationed outside the king's private study, a position he had held countless times before. The hallway was quiet except for the occasional footstep of another guard making their rounds. The king had been meeting with his advisors earlier that evening, discussing what Samuel assumed were routine matters of state, but something was different tonight. The meeting had run longer than usual, and when the advisors finally left, their faces were grim and troubled. Around 11:30, Samuel heard voices rising from within the study. At first, he thought perhaps the king was on a phone call, but as the volume increased, he realized something was seriously wrong. The king's voice, usually so controlled and refined, was becoming increasingly agitated. Samuel had been trained never to eavesdrop on private conversations, but the sound was impossible to ignore. "How could you keep this from me for 30 years? King Edmund's voice boomed through the heavy wooden door. 30 years, Margaret! Do you have any idea what this means?" Samuel's heart began to race. Queen Margaret's voice was quieter, but he could hear the trembling in her tone as she tried to calm her husband. "Edmund, please, we need to think about this carefully. The children, the kingdom, everything we've built. Everything we've built is a lie," the king shouted back. "Every speech I've given, every promise I've made to this country, every time I've looked our people in the eye and told them I would serve them with honor, it's all been built on deception." The sound of something crashing followed, and Samuel instinctively moved closer to the door. His training told him to maintain his position, but his instincts as a protector made him want to ensure the royal family's safety. Through the thick door, he could hear the queen crying softly. "The documents are real, aren't they?" King Edmund's voice had dropped to a whisper, but somehow it was even more frightening than his shouting. "The adoption papers, the falsified birth certificates, all of it." "My father wasn't my father, was he, Margaret?" Samuel felt as though the world had stopped spinning. He knew he shouldn't be listening, but he was frozen in place, unable to move away from what he was hearing. The implications of the king's words were staggering. If what he was saying was true, then the entire royal lineage was in question. Queen Margaret's voice was barely audible. "Your father loved you as his own son, Edmund. That's what matters. King Henry raised you, taught you, prepared you to rule. Nothing changes that." "Everything changes that," the king exploded again. "Don't you understand? I have no legitimate claim to this throne. I'm not a true heir. The people of this kingdom have been following someone who has no right to lead them." Samuel heard footsteps pacing back and forth across the study floor. The king was clearly struggling to process this revelation, and Samuel couldn't blame him. If the conversation he was overhearing was real, then King Edmund had just learned that his entire life had been built on a foundation of lies. "Who else knows about this?" the king demanded. "Who else has known all these years that their king is an imposter?" "Your mother knew, of course," Queen Margaret replied hesitantly. "And Lord Chancellor Williams was involved in arranging everything when you were a baby. But Edmund, you must understand, they did it to protect the kingdom. There was so much uncertainty then, so much chaos. The country needed stability, and you provided that. By living a lie." King Edmund's voice cracked with emotion. "By deceiving an entire nation. How can I ever look at myself in the mirror again, knowing that I've stolen a throne that was never mine to take?" Samuel realized he was witnessing the complete breakdown of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, only to discover that his very right to serve was questionable. The weight of this knowledge was clearly crushing the king. and Samuel felt a deep sympathy for the monarch he had sworn to protect. The conversation continued for another hour, with Queen Margaret trying desperately to console her husband and convince him that his actions as king mattered more than his bloodline. But King Edmund seemed inconsolable. He spoke of feeling like a fraud, of wondering how many other royal secrets were being kept from him, and of fearing what would happen if this information ever became public. The kingdom would tear itself apart, the king said at one point. Some would say I should abdicate immediately. Others would claim that our son has no right to inherit. The whole system would collapse. As Samuel stood guard outside that door, listening to the most powerful man in the kingdom grapple with the most devastating news of his life, he began to understand that he had become an unwitting witness to history. This wasn't just a private family matter. This was information that could change everything for millions of people. When the conversation finally ended and the royal couple emerged from the study, Samuel quickly composed himself and stood at attention. King Edmund's face was red and tear-stained, while Queen Margaret looked as though she had aged 10 years in a single evening. Neither of them looked at Samuel directly, but he could feel the weight of their emotional turmoil as they passed by. As Samuel watched them walk away toward their private chambers, he realized that his life had just become infinitely more complicated. He now possessed knowledge that could destroy the monarchy, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do with it. The oath he had taken as a palace guard bound him to protect the royal family. But how could he protect them from a secret that was already threatening to tear them apart from within? That night, as Samuel lay in his bed in the guards' quarters, he stared at the ceiling and replayed every word he had heard. He thought about King Edmund's anguish, about Queen Margaret's desperate attempts to hold their family together, and about the impossible position they were all now in. He also thought about his own role in this unfolding drama, and wondered whether his silence would be enough to protect the secret he now carried. Little did Samuel know that this was only the beginning. The events he had witnessed that night would soon spiral far beyond anything he could imagine, involving palace conspiracies, family betrayals, and a revelation that would force an entire kingdom to confront the difference between truth and loyalty. Part 2. The Web of Deception. The days following that fateful evening brought no peace to Thornwick Castle. Samuel Harrison noticed immediately that the atmosphere in the palace had changed dramatically. King Edmund moved through his daily duties like a man sleepwalking, going through the motions of his royal responsibilities while clearly struggling with the weight of his newfound knowledge. Queen Margaret, meanwhile, seemed to be working overtime to maintain normalcy. But Samuel could see the strain in her eyes during every public appearance. What Samuel didn't expect was to discover that he wasn't the only one who knew something was wrong. 3 days after the confrontation he had overheard, Samuel was approached by Lady Catherine Worthington, the king's private secretary and one of his most trusted advisors. Lady Catherine had worked in the palace for over 20 years and had a reputation for being both discreet and fiercely loyal to the royal family. "Samuel," she said quietly, pulling him aside during a shift change, "I need to speak with you privately. It's a matter of utmost importance." They met in a small anteroom that was rarely used, and Lady Catherine's first words sent a chill down Samuel's spine. "I know you heard the conversation the other night," she said without preamble. "The walls in this palace aren't as thick as people think, and you weren't the only guard on duty that evening." Samuel's heart sank. If multiple people had overheard the king's outburst, then the secret was already beginning to spread. "Lady Catherine, I can assure you that I would never—" "I know you wouldn't betray the king's confidence," she interrupted. "That's why I'm talking to you, because we have a much bigger problem than you realize." Lady Catherine went on to explain that the documents King Edmund had discovered were just the tip of the iceberg. For decades, there had been a small group of palace insiders who had worked to keep various royal secrets buried. These weren't just minor indiscretions or embarrassing family matters. They were fundamental deceptions that went to the heart of the monarchy's legitimacy. King Edmund's adoption was arranged by his grandfather, King George, when the original heir died in a hunting accident, Lady Catherine revealed. But Edmund wasn't just any orphan they decided to raise as their own. He was actually the illegitimate son of King George's brother, Prince Albert, who had died in the war. The royal family decided it was better to present him as King Henry's biological son rather than acknowledge the complicated truth. Samuel struggled to process this information. "So the king does have royal blood?" Yes, but not in the way the public believes. And that's not even the most complicated part, Lady Catherine continued. The documents that were recently discovered don't just reveal Edmund's true parentage, they also show that there were other potential heirs who were passed over and some of them are still alive. The implications of this revelation were staggering. If there were living relatives with potentially stronger claims to the throne, then King Edmund's position was even more precarious than he realized. But Lady Catherine wasn't finished with her shocking disclosures. There's also the matter of Prince Michael, she said, referring to King Edmund's younger brother, who had always lived a relatively quiet life away from the spotlight. He's not adopted like Edmund. He actually is King Henry's biological son, which means he technically has a stronger claim to the throne than his older brother. Samuel felt as though the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Does Prince Michael know about any of this? That's what we're trying to figure out, Lady Catherine replied grimly. Because if he doesn't know, we need to decide whether to tell him. And if he does know, we need to understand why he's never challenged Edmund's right to rule. As if this situation wasn't complicated enough, Lady Catherine then revealed that there were signs someone might be trying to use this information for their own purposes. Strange inquiries had been made at the royal archives, certain documents had gone missing, and there had been unusual activity around some of the people who had been involved in the original cover-up decades ago. Lord Chancellor Williams, who helped arrange Edmund's adoption, died last year, Lady Catherine explained. But before he died, his personal papers were stolen from his estate. We believe someone is gathering evidence to either blackmail the royal family or expose the truth publicly. Samuel realized that what had started as a private family crisis was rapidly becoming a potential national catastrophe. What does the king want to do about all of this? That's the problem, Lady Catherine said with a heavy sigh. The king is paralyzed by guilt and uncertainty. He keeps talking about abdicating, about confessing everything to the public, about stepping aside for someone with a legitimate claim. But he doesn't understand that there might not be anyone with a clearly legitimate claim at this point. She explained that the royal succession had been manipulated and managed for so long that untangling the web of deceptions would be nearly impossible. Multiple generations of marriages, adoptions, and strategic decisions had created a situation where the rightful heir was no longer clear to determine. Queen Margaret is trying to hold everything together, Lady Catherine continued. But she's fighting a losing battle. The king won't listen to reason, and she's terrified that if this information becomes public, it will destroy not just their family, but the entire institution of monarchy. Samuel asked the question that had been weighing on his mind since the night he first overheard the royal couple's argument. What's my role in all of this? Why are you telling me these things? Lady Catherine's expression grew even more serious. Because we need allies we can trust. And because we think you might be able to help us in ways that others cannot. As a guard, you have access to parts of the palace and opportunities to observe things that we might miss. We need to know if anyone else is gathering information. If there are people in the palace who might be working against the royal family's interests. She paused before adding, and because we might need your testimony someday. If this situation escalates and the truth comes out, having a credible witness who can vouch for the king's character and his reaction to learning this information might be crucial. As Samuel processed everything Lady Catherine had told him, he began to understand that he had become entangled in something far more complex than a simple family secret. This was a conspiracy that stretched back decades, involved multiple generations of the royal family, and could potentially reshape the entire kingdom. There's one more thing you need to know, Lady Catherine said as their conversation was drawing to a close. We've received intelligence that suggests someone plans to make these revelations public within the next few weeks. We don't know who, and we don't know exactly what evidence they have, but we believe they're planning to release information that will force the royal family's hand. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Days, maybe weeks at most, she replied. Which means we need to be prepared for anything. The king might be forced to make a public statement. The media will undoubtedly go into a frenzy, and there could be serious political ramifications that extend far beyond just the royal family. As Samuel left that meeting, his head was spinning with the complexity of the situation he had inadvertently become part of. What had started as accidentally overhearing a private argument had evolved into being a key player in a drama that could change the course of history. He realized that the coming days would test not only his loyalty to the crown, but also his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of palace politics and royal intrigue. That evening, as he resumed his duties, Samuel found himself looking at every member of the royal household with new eyes. Who else knew these secrets? Who could be trusted? And most importantly, who might be planning to use this information to destroy everything the royal family had worked to build? The answers to these questions would soon become clear, but not in ways that anyone could have anticipated. Part 3. The Conspiracy Unfolds. Samuel Harrison's world turned upside down completely when he discovered the true scope of the conspiracy threatening the royal family. It began with a chance encounter that would reveal just how deep the deception ran, and how many people were involved in the plot against King Edmund. 2 weeks after his conversation with Lady Catherine Worthington, Samuel was conducting a routine security check of the palace's east wing when he noticed something unusual. A light was on in Lord Chancellor William's former office, a room that had been sealed since his death the previous year. According to palace protocol, no one should have access to that room without explicit permission from the king or queen. Samuel approached carefully, his training taking over as he assessed the potential security threat. As he drew closer to the door, he could hear voices inside. At least 2 people were having what sounded like an intense discussion. He positioned himself where he could observe without being detected, and was shocked to recognize one of the voices. Prince Michael, King Edmund's younger brother, was inside the sealed office with someone Samuel didn't immediately recognize. But it was the content of their conversation that made Samuel's blood run cold. "The documents are authentic," Prince Michael was saying in a voice much harder than his usual gentle tone. "I'd had them verified by 3 different experts. Edmund has no legitimate claim to the throne, and he never did. And you're absolutely certain that your father never intended for you to inherit?" the other voice asked. Samuel still couldn't see who was speaking, but the voice was clearly that of an older man with an upper-class accent. "My father made his choice based on lies and manipulation," Prince Michael replied bitterly. "He was told that I was too young, too unstable, too unprepared to rule when he was making his succession plans. But the real reason was that certain people in this palace wanted Edmund on the throne because he was easier to control." Samuel felt as though he had been punched in the stomach. Prince Michael knew about Edmund's adoption, but clearly his understanding of the situation was very different from what Lady Catherine had shared. More troubling still, he seemed to be actively plotting against his own brother. "The public deserves to know the truth," the unknown man continued. "They deserve to know that they've been following a pretender for the past 15 years. And more importantly, they deserve to have a legitimate monarch on the throne. The transition will be difficult," Prince Michael acknowledged. "But I've spent years preparing for this moment. I have support from key members of parliament, several high-ranking military officers, and influential members of the nobility who have grown tired of Edmund's weak leadership." Samuel realized he was witnessing the planning stages of what amounted to a royal coup. Prince Michael wasn't just upset about learning family secrets. He was actively working to overthrow his brother and claim the throne for himself. "What about Queen Margaret and the children?" the unknown man asked. "They'll be protected, of course," Prince Michael replied, though his tone suggested this wasn't his primary concern. "But they'll need to understand that their position in the royal family will change significantly. Edmund's son will no longer be heir to the throne, and Margaret will no longer be queen consort. And if Edmund refuses to step down quietly, then we'll be forced to make the information public and let the people decide," Prince Michael said with a coldness that Samuel had never heard from him before. "I'd prefer to handle this as a family matter, but if Edmund forces our hand, we're prepared for a public confrontation." He needed to get this information to Lady Catherine and the king immediately. But as he began to move away from the door, he accidentally knocked over a small decorative table in the hallway. The crash echoed through the quiet corridor, and the conversation in the office immediately stopped. "What was that?" he heard Prince Michael ask sharply. Samuel had no choice but to think quickly. He couldn't let them know he had been listening, so he made noise walking down the hallway and then doubled back, approaching the office as though he was conducting a routine patrol. "Your Highness?" he called out as he knocked on the door. "I noticed a light in this office during my security rounds. Is everything all right?" After a moment, Prince Michael opened the door looking slightly flustered, but trying to maintain his composure. "Oh, Samuel." "Yes, everything is fine. I was just retrieving some documents that belonged to Lord Chancellor Williams. Family business, you understand." Samuel nodded respectfully, but made note of the fact that Prince Michael was alone in the room now. The other man had apparently disappeared, which meant there was probably another exit from the office that Samuel wasn't aware of. "Of course, Your Highness. I'll make note in the security log that you were accessing the room with proper authorization." "That won't be necessary," Prince Michael said quickly. "As I said, it's just family business. Nothing that needs to be officially recorded." This response only confirmed Samuel's suspicions that something inappropriate was happening. No legitimate royal business would require avoiding official documentation. After Prince Michael left, Samuel waited several minutes before entering the office himself. What he found there provided even more disturbing evidence of the conspiracy he had stumbled upon. Scattered across Lord Chancellor William's old desk were photocopies of birth certificates, adoption papers, marriage records, and other official documents dating back several decades. Someone had clearly been conducting extensive genealogical research into the royal family's bloodline. More concerning still, Samuel found notes in Prince Michael's handwriting outlining a detailed plan for revealing King Edmund's illegitimate claim to the throne. The notes included timelines, lists of media contacts, and strategies for managing public reaction to the revelations. One particular document caught Samuel's attention: a letter addressed to the Prime Minister, apparently drafted but not yet sent, in which Prince Michael laid out his case for why the government should support his claim to the throne over his brothers. The letter painted King Edmund as an unwitting participant in a decades-old deception, and argued that the country needed legitimate leadership in these uncertain times. Samuel carefully photographed several of the most damaging documents with his phone before quietly leaving the office. He now had concrete evidence that Prince Michael was plotting against King Edmund, but he also realized that this conspiracy was much larger than just a dispute between brothers. The next morning, Samuel requested an urgent meeting with Lady Catherine Worthington. When he shared what he had discovered, her reaction was one of shock and dismay, but not complete surprise. "We suspected something like this might be happening," she admitted. "Prince Michael has been asking unusual questions about palace security procedures and requesting access to historical documents, but we hoped his interest was merely academic." "This goes far beyond academic interest," Samuel replied, showing her the photographs he had taken. "He's planning to overthrow the king, and he has outside help doing it." Lady Catherine studied the documents carefully, her face growing more grave with each page. "Some of these names I recognize: Lord Hampton, Sir Richard Blackwood, General Morrison. If these people are supporting Prince Michael's claim, then this conspiracy reaches into the highest levels of government and military." "What do we do now?" Samuel asked. "Now we have to make some very difficult decisions," Lady Catherine replied. "Do we tell King Edmund what his brother is planning? Do we try to stop Prince Michael ourselves? Or do we prepare for the possibility that this conspiracy will succeed?" As they discussed their limited options, both Samuel and Lady Catherine realized that they were no longer just trying to protect a family secret. They were now fighting to preserve the monarchy itself, and the outcome of their efforts would determine the future of the entire kingdom. The stakes had never been higher, and time was running out. Part 4. The Reckoning. The final confrontation came sooner than anyone expected, and it unfolded in ways that no one could have predicted. Samuel Harrison found himself at the center of events that would reshape not only the royal family, but the entire understanding of truth, loyalty, and leadership in the kingdom. It began on a Tuesday morning when King Edmund summoned Samuel to his private study, the same room where Samuel had first overheard the conversation that started this entire ordeal. When Samuel arrived, he found not just the king, but also Queen Margaret and Lady Catherine Worthington waiting for him. "Samuel," King Edmund began, his voice heavy with exhaustion and determination, "Lady Catherine has informed me of everything you've discovered about my brother's activities. I want to hear it directly from you. Every detail, every document, everything you witnessed." For the next hour, Samuel recounted everything he had seen and heard, from Prince Michael's secret meeting to the documents he had found in Lord Chancellor William's former office. King Edmund listened without interruption, his face growing more pained with each revelation about his brother's betrayal. When Samuel finished his account, the room fell into heavy silence. Queen Margaret was crying softly, and Lady Catherine looked as though she had aged years in the span of an hour. King Edmund sat motionless for several long minutes before finally speaking. 30 years, he said quietly. For 30 years, I've tried to be the best king I could be, despite learning that my entire life was built on deception. I've wrestled with questions about my legitimacy, my right to rule, my duty to this kingdom. And all this time, my own brother has been plotting to destroy everything I've worked to build. Edmund, Queen Margaret began gently. We still don't know exactly what Michael is planning to do with this information. Perhaps there's still time to reach out to him, to find a way to resolve this as a family. King Edmund shook his head sadly. Margaret, my dear, did you not hear what Samuel reported? Michael has already made his choice. He's gathered allies, prepared documents, drafted letters to government officials. This isn't a brother seeking truth. This is a pretender organizing a coup. Lady Catherine cleared her throat carefully. Your Majesty, we need to consider our options. We can try to prevent Prince Michael from releasing this information. We can prepare our own public statement to control the narrative, or we can attempt to discredit his claims by challenging the authenticity of his evidence. No, King Edmund said firmly, surprising everyone in the room. We're not going to cover this up anymore, and we're not going to fight lies with more lies. I've spent weeks agonizing over this situation, and I've finally reached a decision about what needs to happen. He stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, gathering his thoughts before continuing. For too long, this family has been built on secrets and deceptions. My grandfather covered up the truth about my parentage because he thought it was best for the kingdom. My parents continued that deception because they thought it would provide stability. And I've been living with the weight of that lie for 30 years. Edmund, what are you saying? Queen Margaret asked, though from her tone Samuel could tell she was afraid she already knew. I'm saying it's time for the truth, Margaret. All of it. Not Michael's version of the truth, which is designed to serve his ambitions, but the complete, honest story of what happened and why. King Edmund turned back to face the room, and Samuel was struck by how much the monarch had changed over the past few weeks. The uncertainty and anguish that had marked his demeanor was gone, replaced by something resembling peace and resolution. I'm going to call a press conference, King Edmund announced. I'm going to tell the people of this kingdom exactly who I am, how I came to be their king, and why I believe my actions as their ruler matter more than the circumstances of my birth.
Edmund, that's incredibly risky, Lady Catherine warned. If you reveal this information yourself, you lose all control over how it's presented and interpreted.
The media will sensationalize it. Political opponents will use it against the monarchy, and there's no guarantee that the public will react favorably. Perhaps, King Edmund acknowledged, but the alternative is allowing my brother to control this narrative, and his version of events paints me as either a knowing participant in a massive deception or a fool who was manipulated for decades. Neither of those characterizations serves the truth or the kingdom. Queen Margaret stepped forward and took her husband's hands. Are you certain about this, Edmund? Once you make this public, there's no going back. Our children will have to live with the consequences of this revelation for the rest of their lives. Our children will grow up in a family that chose truth over convenience, King Edmund replied. They'll understand that real leadership sometimes requires making difficult choices and accepting difficult consequences. Over the next several days, King Edmund worked with his most trusted advisors to prepare for what would become one of the most significant royal addresses in the kingdom's history. Samuel found himself playing an unexpectedly important role in these preparations, as his first-hand knowledge of Prince Michael's conspiracy provided crucial context for understanding how to present the king's side of the story. The press conference was scheduled for the following Monday, but Prince Michael forced the timeline to accelerate when he learned of his brother's plans. On Friday afternoon, Prince Michael called his own press conference and began to release selected documents and information about King Edmund's illegitimate claim to the throne. But Prince Michael had made a critical miscalculation. His presentation was clearly designed to serve his own ambitions rather than provide complete information to the public. He focused heavily on King Edmund's lack of biological connection to the previous king, while downplaying his own royal blood and exaggerating his own qualifications to rule. More damaging still, investigative journalists quickly began uncovering evidence of Prince Michael's conspiracy, including his meetings with political and military figures who stood to benefit from a change in leadership. Within hours of his press conference, the story had shifted from questions about King Edmund's legitimacy to concerns about Prince Michael's attempt to stage a royal coup. King Edmund's response was swift and decisive. Rather than waiting for Monday's scheduled address, he called an emergency session of Parliament and requested time to address both the legislative body and the nation directly. Samuel was among the small group of palace staff who accompanied King Edmund to Parliament that evening. As he watched the king walk confidently into the chamber where he would either secure his position or lose his throne forever, Samuel reflected on how much had changed since that night he first overheard a royal argument. King Edmund's address was remarkable in its honesty and humility. He acknowledged that he was not the biological son of the previous king, explained the circumstances of his adoption and the reasons his family had chosen to keep it secret, and admitted that he had only learned the full truth himself within the past month. But rather than apologizing for his position or questioning his right to rule, King Edmund made a powerful case for why leadership should be based on actions rather than bloodlines. He outlined his accomplishments as king, his dedication to serving the people, and his vision for a monarchy that earned its authority through service rather than claiming it through birth. "I cannot change the circumstances of my birth," King Edmund declared, "but I can control the choices I make as your king. I have spent 15 years working to serve this kingdom with honor, integrity, and dedication. I have made mistakes, as all leaders do, but I have never stopped believing in the importance of putting the welfare of our people above my own interests." The speech concluded with King Edmund's announcement that he would submit to a parliamentary vote of confidence, allowing the elected representatives of the people to decide whether his leadership should continue regardless of questions about his bloodline. The vote, when it came 3 days later, was overwhelmingly in favor of King Edmund's continued reign. Even many members of Parliament who had initially supported Prince Michael's claims recognized that the king's honesty and willingness to submit to democratic oversight demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the kingdom needed. Prince Michael's conspiracy collapsed completely when several of his key supporters publicly distanced themselves from his cause. The attempted coup had not only failed, but had backfired spectacularly, damaging Prince Michael's own reputation and strengthening King Edmund's position. In the weeks that followed, Samuel watched as King Edmund seemed to find a new confidence and purpose in his role as monarch. The burden of carrying family secrets had been lifted, and the king's approval ratings actually increased as the public responded positively to his honesty and transparency. Prince Michael quietly withdrew from public life, and while the brothers eventually reconciled privately, their relationship would never be the same. The conspiracy had revealed fundamental differences in their characters and values that could not be easily overcome. For Samuel, the entire experience had been transformative. He had learned that sometimes protecting those you serve means helping them face difficult truths rather than helping them avoid them. He had also learned that real leadership often requires choosing between what is easy and what is right, even when the consequences of that choice are uncertain. As he returned to his duties as a palace guard, Samuel carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to serve the crown. It wasn't about protecting secrets or maintaining comfortable illusions. It was about supporting leaders who had the courage to face the truth no matter how difficult, and who put the welfare of their people above their own comfort and security. King Edmund had proven that true royal authority comes not from bloodlines or birth certificates, but from the willingness to serve with honesty, integrity, and genuine care for those who depend on your leadership. In the end, that lesson was more valuable than any secret Samuel had helped protect, and more powerful than any conspiracy he had helped expose. The kingdom was stronger because its king had chosen truth over convenience, and Samuel was proud to have played a small part in helping that truth come to light.